Welcome to Around the Farm, the podcast about all things ag. I'm your host, Clint Chafford, and today we're going to be talking about marketing and how it can impact your bottom line. We're joined today by Steve Nicholson, a grain and oilseed analyst with Rabo AgriFinance. And he's going to be talking about what's going on with the market, some of the key things you should know as we go into this spring. So stay with us. It's going to be an exciting show. Hey, Steve, thanks for joining us again. I know, our audience was really excited when you came on and gave us an update last fall. So really excited to see you back on the show here again. So, but hey, for those listeners that are new, how about you give us a little background and let us know what you do for Rabo Bank.
Sure. So thank you for having me back on. It's great to be back on with you. We had a great time last fall. So I am the senior grains and oilseed analyst sitting in the rural bank here in St. Louis. It's very cold and snowy here like it is across much of the Corn Belt. My background is research and analysis, but that's not been all of it. I've done a lot of commodity procurement for Fortune 500 food companies. I've done some grain merchandising and trading along the way. I also had a little politics in my background as well, so I do have a love for as I tell people, though, I don't think it's as much fun as it was when I was there. But so I've had a lot of experience along the supply chain and really have enjoyed my career in agriculture. I meet good people like you, and I really, really enjoy it. So
that is great. Well, hey, one thing is this year, right? This past year, I mean, It's no doubt has been a little crazy on a lot of different levels, right?
Exactly.
I try not to use the word unprecedented because I think we hear that constantly, but
right.
But it's pretty much what it's been. But one nice thing is it seems like the markets have really turned around and started to look a lot better. What's really been the drive, for that?
Yeah, it is one of these things, and unprecedented is a word you don't want to use very often. It's kind of like disruption and sustainability. But I can't remember a time where the markets, if we had talked 7 months ago, it was gloom and doom, and there was no light at the end of the tunnel. And almost overnight, it just, the light opened up when we were at the end of the tunnel. And the only time I can think of close to that would be in November of 93 when the flood didn't matter, and USDA came back and said, oh, by the way, it did matter, never mind, and the markets turned around. That's about the closest analogy or the closest, year to look at and think that happened. But your question is spot on. There are a number of things that drove this, and I think, a lot of these, but there are also some deeper things we have to consider. This is both a supply-led and a demand-led rally. That's pretty unusual. You don't see that happen in the same year. Obviously, it was dry in the Western Corn Belt. And for those people out there, it was tough. It was a tough year to start off with, and it didn't get any better throughout the year. And then on August 10th, the derecho came through right through the center of the Corn Belt where you don't want it to come, and really, particularly in Iowa, really destroyed a lot of acres of corn. And it didn't hurt beans as much, but it didn't seem like beans just never really maybe came back from that very well. And so that got this thing started. And, when the USDA started coming out, it kind of, we started to see those lower yield numbers. And of course, it just snowballed throughout the year. So that was one piece that led this market higher. The other piece was the demand side. And this is a much more stronger incentive for the market to go higher is demand. And it all centered on China. Their hog herd was rebuilding. They're moving to the Western-style production, Western-style feed rations, no more garbage feeding in the backyards. I'm not sure how they enforce that, but that's happening. And then just the fact is they need stuff. Their domestic food prices are high. I'll share this with you because as prices are going up, I sort of joked with my colleague in Shanghai, and I said, well, are we getting to a place where our prices are too high? And he said, No, you're a long ways away. Currently, prices in China right now are $11 to $12 a bushel for corn, just to give you an idea of what's happening there.
Wow.
So you have, exactly. Yeah, I think it impacted some early on, is that China wanted, they wanted to try to make that, because in that culture, if you make a promise, you fulfill that promise. And so I think there was part of that in the process.
Wow. Yeah. Just, again, just a lot going on, right? And
absolutely.
Not our typical year, I guess.
No,
let's hope it's not our typical year. I guess put it that way.
It's been exhausting. I'll say that.
I could imagine. Well, that's really looking at it from a really wide lens and looking at it from a lot of different angles. When we get localized and really get down to the farmer, right? I think of my dad right now, who's probably trying to figure out how to market, the rest of his grain, right?
Yeah.
How does this impact, a lot of our farmers, just their marketing strategies? How do you keep up with this?
Well, first of all, it's hard to keep up, and I think we have to acknowledge that right up front. But there are some things we need to think about and we need to be doing. I mean, your dad back on the farm, my guess is, and I would guess this is not unusual, probably some seller's remorse this year. Gosh, if I just held on longer, I could have got a higher price. And my answer to that is, you made the best decision you could with the information at the time. Could you have foreseen the demand side coming from China? Could you have seen all the yield stress from drought and derecho? I don't think we could have seen all that. Even as late as August, I think we were all sort of surprised by that. So I think we have, give yourself a break, let yourself off the hook a little bit. Let's move forward rather than look back and worry about that. That's kind of my first counsel if you have it. But I think when you look at 2020 crop, if you have 2020 crop left, when you look at the board, I have the board, I'm looking at the futures here right now. You still have corn, you still have soybeans at inverse markets. The market is telling you we are not going to pay to store it. We want that crop now. So I would be an aggressive seller of 2020 crop now. Get it done. The market's telling you that's what I want. And just as a reminder, kind of 2 points. If we went back when we talked, even before we talked a little bit last fall, if I had said you'd have $5 on the board, on the corn board, you'd have $6 on the wheat board, and you'd have $13, $14 on the bean board, you would have said, I'll sell my crop for the next 10 years. Okay, here's your chance. Let's do it. Because we know we can make money at these levels. Let's do it. We look forward to 21 and 22. It's a more nuanced discussion. Can you make money? I'm looking at 21 D's corn, $4.59.5 as we talk here today. Can you make money selling that board price? Look at your local basis. More than likely you can.
Yep.
So let's move on. Let's get some sales in place for 21. If I look at 22 here, the board's trading at $4.23. Not as good a price, but certainly a good price above $4. Let's think about that. I think you cannot let this opportunity go by. Beans is a little tougher decision. The bean market is very, very tight. You look at the inverse in beans, it's, new crop beans right now are $11.86. Still not a bad price. Probably worth selling some beans there. You look out to 22, it's $10.75. Then you're starting to get maybe a little bit concerning. But, and I do think I'm a little more friendly beans because of how tight the S&D is. But same thing with wheat. You start looking at wheat numbers and you look out at July of this year and think about where we are in Chicago, where we are in Kansas City, $6.50 wheat, and even look out even farther, you're still above $6. Those are good numbers. And as this makes my banker colleagues happy. If you can take risk off the table now, lock in margins, I'll guarantee your spouse sleeps better. You'll sleep better, and your banker sleeps better. And This is a margin business. This is not about hitting grand slams or home runs. Let's hit singles and doubles and lock in margins that keep you in business for another year. That's what we're here for.
No, I couldn't agree more, Steve. And you talk about dad and buyer's remorse, right? And there was some beans that got sold right out of the field, right? And him and I've had those conversations where it's like, man, I missed out on a big chunk. But I think it is to your point. I think you have to look at where your risk is, what you're averaging, and what the right thing to do at that point in time is, right? I mean, if we could look into the future, we all go back and buy a whole bunch of, Amazon stock or something, right?
Absolutely.
It's easy to say after Monday morning quarterback, right?
Yeah.
But the other interesting part, so is there any trends that the farmers need to be looking at as far as for like a 3 to 6 months out, to start wondering, is this going to start changing as we get closer to, this spring or even into next fall?
Yeah. Now we're optimistic for 2 or 3 years that this Chinese demand is real. And you look at the corn, like I talk about corn, boy, they've got a lot of work to do to try to be self-sufficient in corn or be there. So we're optimistic for 2 or 3 years. But having said that, and your question is spot on, what are the risks out there we need to be paying attention to? So the first thing I think about is the calendar. So what's the next big risk on the calendar that we have to think about that could impact the market that I'm sitting here watching? March 31, we get prospective planting report. USDA showed today, 92 million acres of corn is on their balance sheet, 91 million acres of beans. Our balance sheet, when we just did our 10-year baseline forecast, we were at 91 on corn and we were at 89 and some few acres on beans. So those are record acres, going forward. So that would be the first time I would think about there could be a risk for this market to have a pretty serious correction or setback when it looks at those numbers and go, wow, 180, could you say 182, 183 million acres of corn and soybeans? That would be an all-time record. So I have to think about that as well. The other risk, of course, we'll see the final acreage number in June. That would be the next time I would be thinking about where is the risk of what that number is, and also think about that because that kind of comes to that July 4th time frame. The July 4th time frame is a time frame the market really sort of sits back and thinks, okay, we got the crop planted, we got it up out of the ground, it looks healthy. What is the weather looking forward? What is the pollination weather looking forward? And it kind of thinks, boy, we're either too high priced or we need to go up or something there. That will be, from a time frame thinking about the risk, and obviously the August 10th or the August crop production would be the next time. One of the risks that we're starting to worry about, or one of the risks two risks we're starting to think about going forward is China and ASF and hogs. Mm-hmm. There's some discussion, and we're going to have a more nuanced discussion tomorrow morning, the group, is more mutants of ASF. Wonder if that comes back again. That could be really detrimental to both corn and soybeans and soybean meal demand. So I think we have to be paying very close attention to that. The other risk, and this is really a little bit beyond 3 to 6 months, but I think you need to be thinking about it now from a standpoint of looking at your input costs. We all know, and you're an input company, and you know where you were before, during 2006, 7, 8, 9, how things were, and how they were after 14. And and I think it's fair to say it's been tough for everybody. So if you're a farmer, and we know as commodity prices go up, input costs go up, and farmers will want to take advantage of that. So let's think about, maybe we need to think about locking in another year of input costs, or what can we lock in to take risk off the table? And that's a discussion that farmers need to have with themselves and their operation, and also with their input suppliers. There are opportunities for all parties there, and I want to make sure that everyone thinks about that, because that's, we want to try to preserve as much margin as long as we can.
Yeah, no, those are great points there, Steve. As we look at, making some of these longer decisions, right? And you talked about, what am I doing for 22, 23, right? Some of those pieces. Yeah. As a farmer, how would I determine what percentage do I go with? Because I go back to like this year, if a Draco hits, that was devastating, right? And it's absolutely. How do I manage some of that through of saying I don't want to oversell or overposition myself? How do I kind of work through some of those decisions? Yeah,
no, it's a good question, and one of the things we always talk about is don't forget you have crop insurance. Crop insurance is your ultimate backstop. Granted you're at 75 or 80 or 85% coverage, and we're not, when we think about 22 coverage or selling coverage, I'm not saying sell the whole farm. Let's get in there. Let's get 25. Let's get 20. Let's get 25. Let's get a third of that crop on the ground or sold and off the thing. That gives you plenty of room. And if you have a Draco, heaven forbid, none of us want to see that.
No, not at all.
you know that crop insurance is there to backstop you. And yeah, you're going to not make the money you thought you were going to make, but it's going to bring you back to be as whole as you can be as to where you started the year at, and you're not going to be in a hole to start the new crop year. And so we want to, make sure that people understand crop insurance is sort of a marketing tool as well. Yeah. It's not just an insurance policy.
No, I think that's a great way to look at it, right? And it's a good tool to use there. So I've even seen that locally around us. If you drive across the countryside right now, almost every hog barn that's out there has a solar system up now, right? And and you're seeing this all over. My wife and I installed one, had one installed on our garage, right?
There's
a
lot
of incentives that are going out, but I do think there's actually a lot of opportunities for farmers to take advantage of, and then you start breaking into the carbon market, right? Which is really coming on quite a bit here lately as well. So Dad and I have talked about that. What are those next steps? What are those next opportunities?
Right, and you think about cover crops, you think about methane digesters, and you think about the dairy industry and even beef for that matter. Can you think about water? We have a client in Kansas who, and I hope I get this all right, is a cattle feeder. When they set that cattle operation up, they were very concerned about water availability. They recycle all that waste and pull clean water back out of all that waste and use that in the operation because they're concerned about water. I mean, they're held up as a wow. There are opportunities there, and in a company who buys their beef, let's kind of put that in the supply chain, is going to look at that and go, wow, I can talk about that in my marketing. I'm buying sustainable beef, so to speak. Yep. Those are things that are important that we have to realize, whether we like them or not, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, believe me. These are right, wrong, or different. There are consumers who are concerned about that, and that's important to them. And if they're willing to pay for it, then we need to be willing to sell it to them.
Yeah, no, absolutely. How do you see this impacting the ethanol market? Where do you see that going?
Yeah. Remember I talked about the fight between the far left and I'll call it the center left of the Democratic Party. I think this is going to be one of those places as a fight.
Have you been reading anything lately that you'd recommend to our listeners to go out and read?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Got a couple books on my table I'm reading right now. For those of you who are old like me, might remember Dan Morgan's Merchants of Grain, published back in, I believe, 1979. It was the first sort of peek into the grain world, and for people who don't have any idea, it was like, wow, didn't realize that these people had this much power. Now most of those companies are gone, other than Cargill at this point, which is interesting in and of itself. But there's a new one called The New Merchants of Grain that came out from a British author who was encouraged to rewrite The New Merchants of Grain. So I'm reading that. His name is John Kingsman, I believe is the name. It's A New Merchants of Grain, and it talks about the grain industry today. Also does interviews with people, which is interesting from a different perspective. And I just had a friend of mine in Iowa send me a book that's called, now I can't remember. It's about Harry S. Truman. It's about, I was going to bring it downstairs, and now I can't remember. But it talks about the first 4 months of administration, the accidental president, that's it. And it talks about his first 4 months in office. And, people didn't know Harry S. Truman. He was a senator here from Missouri that was kind of nondescript, and he didn't have much to do as vice president. And then Franklin Delano Roosevelt dies on April 12th, 1945, and the world changed. And it talks about, use the word unprecedented. When you said that, I thought about the book. You think about, and I can't name all the things that happened, but in that time period, all the things that happened that he had to make decisions on, and he wasn't prepared because he wasn't even informed about the Manhattan Project. But, Europe fell. The nuclear bomb was dropped. The United Nations was formed. The meeting between Churchill, Stalin, and Truman. And we think about all the things, and it kind of put in perspective all the things on Biden's plate, and not to diminish what he has in front of him because we were in the middle of a pandemic. But you think about that in Truman, and it's just almost overwhelming to think about. So those are the two books I'm looking at right now. It's a good book to help put in perspective what's happening today as well.
I'm glad you brought that up. I will put that on my list. I love documentaries, and
me too.
Especially on those kind of topics. Just absolutely wonderful. So, well, hey, the other thing that I was going to ask is, you all have a podcast over at Rabo as well, right?
We do.
So tell us about that, and how can folks, our listeners, find y'all?
Sure. So if you go out and Google or go to your favorite podcast machine, Google North American Rabobank or North American Rabobank podcast series, and you'll see a whole bunch of them come up, and you'll see our G&O podcast there. So we do that monthly. And so our two G&O analysts, one of them being myself, and we have a group within the bank called Markets, which helps farmers with risk management tools. The three of us get together and we have a conversation once a month about what's happening. And so we tend to do 5 or 6 quick topics up front, and then we'll do sort of a long piece. So we've done everything from, we have our colleagues who from South America or Europe will be in the office, and we'll set them down and we'll have a conversation with them, or we'll talk about, we talked a lot about many things we've talked about here because of the importance of the markets and producers. And then I think we're going to talk about animal feed, because that's become a really hot topic within the livestock community. So lots of different things we talk about. But go to your favorite podcast engine and Google North American Rabobank podcast series, and you'll find them pop up there. Thanks for asking.
That is absolutely great. I told you before we started recording, I've had the pleasure of watching you present to our group a couple different times, and having this conversation with you. I always look forward to your insights and just all your knowledge in this. So I would urge all of our listeners to go out there and find your podcast. And
thank you.
And I'd also like to say thanks for joining ours here, and look forward to the next time that we get to have a conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. It's been great to have a conversation with you. And these are important topics to go through for producers, for sure.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Steve, and take care.
Thank you, Clint. You too.
Hey, that was a great conversation with Steve. It's always great to talk to him. He's just incredibly knowledgeable, and we thank him for coming on the show, and I hope that you all enjoyed that conversation. With that, I do want to say, if you liked our video, be sure to like the video, subscribe, and ring the bell to get notified each and every time that we come out with new content. Also, we're available wherever you listen to podcasts, and of course, also on YouTube. So with that, we'll see you around the farm.